In a cemetery in Georgian London, a man clutched his shotgun tightly. He was on the hunt for ghosts, and when he saw a white figure approach, he did not hesitate. He pointed his gun and fired. A violent act, a life cut short. Ghosts of murder seem inevitable. But what happens when the ghost does not simply roam? What if it seeks revenge or a confession? Or what if it was never there at all? Just a figment created by hysteria. Tonight we explore 3 real cases of murder where ghosts not only appeared but cracked the case wide open. At the end of 1803 in London, England, police officials were getting worried. Several locals had reported horrifying attacks while walking in Hammersmith churchyard, a dark cemetery dating back to the 17th century. 2 of them had been women, one elderly and one pregnant, who had died from shock a few days later. Rumours started to spread quickly that the culprit was the terrifying ghost of a suicide victim who had been buried there the previous year. In Georgian times it was believed that if someone took their own life and were buried on consecrated ground, their spirit would not be able to rest and would wander the earth for all eternity. The ghost was described as very tall, dressed all in white. A calfskin garment with horns was on its head, and it had large glass eyes which stared down darkly at terrified witnesses. A shortage of police officers in Hammersmith at the time made investigation very difficult. In the absence of a structured inquiry, locals took matters into their own hands. They formed a group watch, taking shifts, patrolling around and through the cemetery, hoping to catch the ghost. One of those who offered to patrol was a man called Francis Smith. He picked up his shotgun and told his friends he was going out to take the ghost, if he could. At the same time, Thomas Millwood was leaving his sister's house and heading for home. A bricklayer by trade, he was still wearing his uniform as he stepped onto the street. He took pride in his trade and kept his linen trousers, shirt and apron a shining white. It was late and very dark. Most people had retreated into their homes, the fear of the ghost a constant fog over the neighbourhood. As the 2 men rounded a corner, suddenly they came face to face. Thomas's uniform shone in the darkness, and a startled Francis shouted, "Damn you! Who are you and what are you? Damn you, I'll shoot you!" before immediately pulling the trigger. Thomas was shot in the left side of his jaw, severing his spine. He was dead before he hit the ground. Francis was arrested and put on trial for murder. The judge urged the jury to dismiss any theory of a ghost, to look at the facts, and reminded them that murder need not have any malice, just the intent to kill. At first they found him guilty of manslaughter, but the judge wouldn't allow the verdict, since there was no self-defence or accidental action. They then found him guilty of murder. Although initially sentenced to death, the sentence was reduced to 1 year of hard labour. Interestingly enough, the real culprit came forward later, forced to do so because of all the publicity surrounding the case. John Graham claimed he had dressed up as a ghost to scare his apprentice. Strangely, there was no punishment for terrorising all of Hammersmith and causing the murder of an innocent bricklayer. The belief of a ghost was enough for a normal man in Georgian England to turn into a killer. But what if a man already jailed for murder is driven to confess by his own victim's ghost? On the 12th of October 2007, a guard at the Salinas Valley State Prison in California was shocked when notorious serial killer Terry Childs demanded to speak to the county attorney's office. He claimed he desperately needed to make a confession because the ghost of his victim was tormenting him. Terry Childs was a serial killer whose rampage spanned from 1979 to 1985, when he was sentenced to life in prison for the killing of Lois Segala in 1987. Childs had killed her because he believed she was an informant, telling police about his other crimes, so he and his girlfriend drove her out to a rural area and shot her several times. But this was just to be the beginning of Child's story. In prison, he would confess to 11 murders with detailed descriptions and locations of corpses. One of these murders was Linda Ann Josevich. Linda had been a cashier at a department store, and one evening as she was leaving work, Childs attacked her in the parking lot and put her in his car. He drove her out to a reservoir where he beat her, strangled her, and then stabbed her to death. Childs claimed it was because he had been fighting with his mother that night and met Linda when he was blinded by rage. She was missing, her fate unknown, until 1995, when her lower jawbone and some ribs were found by a hiker in the Santa Cruz Mountains. While Childs was in prison, he was visited by Linda every night. She would stare up at him in his bunk, dark eyes fixed and empty. He claimed she would then crawl up to him in the darkness, her clawed hands slowly reaching into his skull, and started to eat his brains. When he confessed, he said he needed to free himself from his demons, and when he was convicted and sentenced to another life term, Linda was finally free to rest, and he didn't see her ghost again. Guilt from a man who is unable to feel remorse, or a ghost unable to rest until she had justice? Tell me in the comments, was he just crazy? But what if the evidence is so compelling, so accurate, that it convicts a murderer with no sign of confession? In 1897, Mary Jane Heaster timidly sat down in a dark room. Looking around at the other scared faces, she felt the urge to run, but she stayed fixed in her seat. She would not leave, because Mary was at a séance to contact her recently deceased daughter, and she would not stop until she found out the real and disturbing cause of her death. In the autumn of 1896, a young woman named Elva Zona Heaster met a man called Edward Stribling Trout Shue, a blacksmith in their town in Greenbrier County in West Virginia. The two quickly fell in love and were married within months. But what seemed like a fairy tale was soon to become a tragedy. Zona, as she preferred to be called, was found dead in her home in January of 1897. Without even doing a thorough examination of the body, the coroner gave a verdict of death by heart disease, and she was buried in a local cemetery. Her mother, however, would not believe this story. She had seen the way Edward treated her daughter, that she was so young and healthy when she died, and she vowed to find out the real reason for her daughter's death. She immediately contacted a medium. A séance was organised for her, and she hoped with all her might that she would be able to contact her daughter's spirit in the afterlife and discover the truth. When the medium's eyes rolled back in her head and the room grew dark and cold, the voice of Zona came to Mary. It told her that she must have her body exhumed, dig her up and find out how she died, how her new husband had strangled her. Mary rushed to the authorities and begged them to dig up her daughter's corpse. At first they refused. A message from beyond the grave was not a reason to disturb the dead, to bring them up from the dirt 6 feet down, simply on a whim. But Mary fought them. They eventually went to the archives and discovered that a proper examination had not occurred at the time of death, and this was reason enough for exhumation. When they dug up Zona's body, it was still fresh enough to perform an autopsy. It took 3 hours, but at the end it was found Zona's neck had been broken. The windpipe had been crushed. There were finger-like bruises on her neck. She had been strangled so forcefully that her vertebrae had been dislocated and her ligaments were torn and ruptured. Zona's husband Edward was arrested immediately. During his time in prison waiting for his trial, it was discovered he'd been married twice before. His first wife accusing him of being very cruel, and his second wife had also died under mysterious circumstances. He bragged that it was his wish to have 7 wives. Although the judge tried to persuade the jury to disregard the evidence provided by a ghost, the evidence was overwhelming, and Edward Shue was sentenced to life in prison. However, he would only serve less than 3 more years, as he died in March of 1900 of an unknown disease. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery. If you liked these stories, please give me a like or a comment, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.